Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. I wanted to let you know that I have a poll on my communities tab regarding live streaming and narration in the future. When you're finished listening to these stories, could you check out my communities tab and vote? I really appreciate it. Thank you, and now to the stories. Story 1. A few years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles or 8,500 kilometers around the western U.S. I did this trip solo. At night, I most often preferred to wild camp, simply finding somewhere to disappear into the woods, somewhere people were unlikely to find me and even less likely to care that I was there. The forest makes for far from a quiet night's sleep, but after the first couple weeks, I had grown used to and even found comfort in the sounds of the woods. The constant droning of thousands of crickets and toads was a certainty. It was always a highlight of my night, though not particularly uncommon to hear the yips and howls of a distant pack of coyotes. I fondly recall one night I set up camp right between two owls who hooted back and forth through much of the night. If nothing else, it wouldn't require much of a breeze to stir music from the tree canopy. About a month and a half into this trip, I set up camp one evening in the remote mountains of western Montana. After turning out my light and laying down in bed, I came to a disturbing realization. It was dead silent. There was not a single cricket chirping, no coyotes howling. There wasn't the babbling of a nearby creek, nor even the slightest wind to rustle the dry leaves of early autumn still clinging to the trees. It was truly silent, and that was terrifying. Suddenly, the occasional snapping of a twig, a common sound normally lost in the canopy of the woods, rang out like a gunshot. I can only describe it as the loudest silence I've ever heard, and it almost felt like the entire forest was hiding from an equally silent predator. I slept terribly that night, and I'll never forget the immense relief I felt when I heard the first bird song of the pre-dawn hour. Okay, so that was my spookiest night. What about my greatest moment of actual danger? A few months later, I was in Washington State, heading south near the coast. As I passed through a town, I stopped for lunch. Wanting to mix things up a bit, I decided that rather than finding a park with a picnic table to eat the usual staples I carried with me on the bike, I found one of my preferred fast food places in the town. As I got back on the bike that afternoon, I could tell it wasn't sitting quite right in my stomach, but it didn't slow me down too much. That evening, I once again decided to wild camp. Living outside all day, every day, my sleep schedule pretty much synced up with the sun, and so in November, as far north as Washington, it wasn't concerning that I was in bed with lights out by 7:30. What was concerning, though, was that my usual nighttime routine of setting up camp, journaling, and planning the coming days was not accompanied by copious amounts of snacking. Paddling 80 pounds or 36 kilograms of bike and camping gear for an entire day is hungry work, but on this particular night, I had little appetite. Laying down in bed didn't help. In fact, it made things worse. My stomach ache turned to nausea, and eventually I threw up. Thankfully, I managed to unzip the door of the tent and just poke my head outside. I rinsed my mouth out with one of my water bottles, drank a bit more water to help replenish the fluids I had lost, and then laid back down feeling much better. I got a couple hours of sleep, but eventually woke again feeling nauseous. I went through the whole song and dance again, waves of nausea coming and going, sitting up and laying back down. finally vomit, rinse my mouth, drink some water, back to bed. Around 4:30, I woke for a third and final time. I didn't end up throwing up again, but I also knew I was unlikely to get back to sleep. I decided there was a better use of my time anyways. I dreaded the thought of getting back on the bike. I just had no energy, but I didn't have another choice. Just stay where I was, alone in the woods, and hope and pray that my condition wouldn't get any worse? Besides, I'd used up all my water the night before, so I had to get back to civilization. Studying Google Maps, I found a town about 30 miles or 50 kilometers ahead with a cheap motel. A fairly easy half-day's ride in normal circumstances, where I could get a proper night's sleep and reassess my condition in the morning. Shortly after daybreak, I packed up camp, hiked the bike back to the road, got on, started pedaling, and something felt weird. Oh man, it was a flat tire. Just my luck, right? But I had the tools, spare parts, and knowledge to make the repair, so I got to work. In my less than ideal mental state, it took far longer to repair than it had any right to, and by the time the wheel was back together and holding air, it had started raining. I had little choice other than to put on my jacket, turn on my lights, and just push through it. It wasn't even 8 a.m., and today was already by far the worst day of the entire trip. The words absolute misery don't feel big enough to describe that day, but I don't know how else to summarize it. I was cold and wet. I was hungry, but didn't want to put too much food into my still very upset stomach. I was dehydrated. Remember, I had used up all my water throughout the night, and I was tired in every sense of the word, sleep deprived, physically aching and sore, mentally exhausted. Every rotation of the pedals felt like a feat of Herculean strength, and yet somehow I continued to find that strength. To make a long story slightly shorter, I got to that motel. After a long hot shower and a phone call home to my mom, I slept 13 hours straight and woke the next morning feeling great. I managed to outrun the food poisoning for a couple days, but eventually it caught up to me, thankfully while I was staying in a hotel for a few nights in a larger city. I spent one rest day in the hotel as the food poisoning ran its course, no longer vomiting but now in the form of diarrhea. I know, TMI. At least that got it all out of my system, and from then on, I was fine. In hindsight, I'm just thankful that I was back in civilization while getting over the food poisoning. Story 2. This is a long story with a lot of details, so I'm going to try to make it as short as possible. In high school, my buddy and our girlfriends would go on camping trips. We frequently camped in different spots on a lake called Mud Lake. We noticed after many trips out there that one of the islands, a circular island probably about 40 yards wide in the lake, had very sandy beaches on it. We had decided we'd make a weekend trip and we would camp on the island so we wouldn't have to take our kayaks to the boat launch to go swimming. That Friday we got on the island at around 6 o'clock. All four of us kayaked. My girlfriend had forgotten something in the truck, so her and my buddy's girlfriend left to go get it. It was about a 15-minute trip by kayaks to the island, so we figured it wouldn't take them more than 45 minutes. My buddy and I finished setting up the entire camp, and we sat down in our hammocks and sparked a bowl. After an hour had passed since they first left, we started to get worried, so I went to call them to see where they were at. The first call rang, and no one answered. The second call said, "I have no service." When I went to call a third time, my phone died. My buddy then got his phone out of his bag and went to call, but his phone was somehow dead as well. We decided to just keep waiting. Finally, we heard the girls' voices, talking and giggling. We could hear the sound of the paddles cutting into the water with every stroke. We heard the kayaks hit sand and partially slide up on the beach. Then we heard nothing. We called out to the girls. No response. I went and checked it out, and the girls weren't on the island. So we sat back down and sparked another bowl. By this time, it's completely dark. It would get dark around 9:30 at this time. Just as we were talking about kayaking back to the truck, we heard the girls giggling and talking again. The same thing as before. We hear them get on the island, and then nothing. We both just kind of sat there not knowing what to say. And then it happened again, only about 5 minutes later this time. We then saw a light shining around the lake as if it was coming from a boat. We stood on shore and watched, thinking it was them and that my girlfriend had probably grabbed my headlamp from the truck. We sat back down, and we heard the girls come up to the island again. This time I looked at my buddy, and he looked like he was freaking out. We talked for about 5 minutes about everything, trying to figure out if we were hearing and seeing the same crap. We had come to the conclusion that the weed we were smoking must be laced with something, even though we had never had problems before with the same bag of weed. So we decided that the next time we heard something, we would both point to exactly where we heard it come from. Right after saying this, we heard the girls approaching the island again. We both pointed in the same exact spot. We both went over to the shoreline, and we couldn't see them. We sat back down and again heard the girls, but this time in a different direction. We both pointed. We could clear as day hear their voices, hear their laughs. Then the intervals between the times we would hear them began to shorten, from 5 minutes to 3 minutes to 30 seconds, and soon we started hearing them all around the island. We started to freak out as it felt like it was turning into chaos around us. Finally, it just went completely quiet. Everything seemed so still. We then heard a train whistle, and a train coming as if it was less than a quarter mile away. Then the train just stopped, and we saw a fire on the shore of the mainland. We stood on the shore of the island looking, and we could see at least 6 to 8 people moving around the fire. My buddy yelled out to see if they were making all the noise. As soon as he yelled, we watched the silhouettes of the people we could see just stop, and the fire went out. I mean, the fire went out instantly. A few more weird things happened. Finally, my buddy and I were completely packing up, camping, getting ready to get the F out of there, and we heard something behind us. Both of us snapped around so quick, and it was our girlfriends standing there with confused looks on their faces. We looked at each other, then back at the girls, then we turned back to each other really quick when we both realized it was still light out. The sun was still up. We were both certain it was at least 11 o'clock by that point. We tried our best to explain everything we could to the girls. The girls said it took them a bit longer than usual because they swear they kayaked here, but they didn't see the island, so they figured they must have went around the wrong bend. They said they ended up having to go back to the boat launch and check the maps to see where the island was, which they claimed they went there the first time but didn't see it. We came to the conclusion that the girls were only gone for about an hour and a half. We arrived at 6, and we were off that island by 9. But it had felt like to us, at the very least, 4 to 5 hours. We all still talk about it when we get together. None of us can explain what happened. We have even gone and talked to local tribe elders in the area. We have talked to one tribe's medicine man, and he had a few ideas, but still wasn't sure. Story 3. I was backpacking with my dad and two of our friends, so 2 men in their 40s, and me and my friend were about 15. We were camping at a lake called Kenny Lake in California, a little past a pretty small town called Downeyville. This was way up in the mountains. It was our second full day there, and we spent most of the day fishing around the lake, floating out in special inner tubes for fishing. When we were out floating on these tubes, we noticed there was another large group of people camping on the other side of the lake, which we couldn't see from our campsite because there was a large rock peninsula blocking the view. As the sun began to set, we went back to our campsite and started to cook some fish we caught along with some backpacking food, freeze-dried chili, mac and cheese, etc. We ate all that, hung out around the campfire for a little bit, and then cleaned our dishes and hoisted our coolers up into a tree so no bears or other critters got to them. We got ready to go to bed, and we were separated into 2 tents. Me and my dad in one, and the other boy and his dad in another. Our campsite was located on this sandy patch very close to the lake, with a weird little patch of vegetation and trees of about 30 feet dividing us from the beach of the lake. So we weren't right on the water, but we were really close. It was also right by where the trail split off to loop around the lake, where the only entrance and exit was to the lake. As we tucked into our sleeping bags, my dad fell asleep instantly, as usual, and I had a hard time falling asleep. This was weird because I usually fall asleep pretty easily. I tossed and turned for about an hour, with my dad sound asleep on the other half of the tent, when I got this intense feeling of heavy dread. Something was going off in my brain that something terrible was about to happen. I stayed up for what felt like another 2 hours, but was only 30 minutes according to my watch when I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tiny window on the side of the tent, which opened a fabric flap that had a screen over it so that fresh air could get in, but it was still closed off. As soon as I opened it, my nostrils were burning with the smell of smoke. Crap! I woke up my dad immediately, and as soon as he opened the door to the tent, we could see an extremely faint orangish glow way off in the distance. He put on a headlamp to go outside of the tent, and as soon as he turned it on, it lit up a light cone of smoke in the air and barely lit up the ground. He woke up the other people, and they agreed pretty quickly we needed to get the hell out of there, or we would be crisped to ashes. We packed up our gear as quick as we could, and we were about to go when my friend's dad suddenly remembered the large group of people on the other side of the lake. They were even closer to the raging wildfire, so we all agreed to get over there to wake them up and tell them to get out of there. As soon as we got to the point of the beach on the other side, where we all knew they were camping, we were stumped. They were gone. There wasn't a trace of them there. Even though we walked out on the rocky peninsula that evening to look at the stars and saw their campfire from across the lake, we went the rest of the way around the lake back to our campground as fast as we could to confirm they weren't there, and there was no sign of them ever existing there. We didn't have time to look any further, so we hiked back to our truck and hightailed it out of there. As far as I know, that was the closest the fire got to Kenny Lake, and me and my dad stayed a night in a hotel in the nearby town a few months later, and the fire got pretty close to the lake, but only burned a small area around it. I still think about where those people disappeared to because we would have seen or heard them leave since our campsite was right where the trail split to go back to the main trail. Story 4. My girlfriend at the time and I went camping 5 hours away from home for her birthday and our anniversary. We made the trip the day after a big storm passed through. We left town early and got there in the early afternoon. The guy at the entrance to the campgrounds mentioned there was no one else staying there that weekend. We were like, oh, well, this is going to be sick. First, we drove down these long pathways to our designated area. As you got closer to it, the road narrowed. So basically, you had to back out to get out. We unloaded the car, got the tent set up, and decided to go walk around the woods. It was dead silent, but it was still bright out, so we just took in all the nature we could and walked a few miles away. We reached this point in the woods where there were some weird-looking white cabins. They were very uniform, like all built the exact same way. Like, I guess they were a part of the camping grounds, but they seemed way out of the way, and there was no sign of life. To me, it felt eerie, like we shouldn't be there. So we turned around and walked back. We took a breather in the tent, then tried to start a fire in the fire pit. Unfortunately, neither of us had ever been camping before and had no idea how to start a fire. We had bought some of those self-lighting logs from Walmart and some lighter fluid, but everything else around us was soaked to the bone from the rain that had passed through the day before. We knew we needed kindling of some sort, but any dry sticks or leaves was far and few between. Eventually, we got a small fire going and ate hot dogs and marshmallows and spent some time looking at the stars. Then we noticed just how dark it was out there. My girlfriend was easily spooked and was like, "Can we get into the tent now?" So we put the fire out and crawled into the tent. We were talking to each other, but I could tell she was tense. Suddenly, she put her hand over my mouth and was like, "Shh, do you hear that?" Before I could respond, we heard footsteps. Like heavy footsteps. It sounded like a group of people walking. I whispered to her, "It's probably just animals or something." Then we heard mumbling, like low mumbling. We couldn't make out words, but it didn't sound like a sound an animal could make. It sounded like, well, words, but hushed. We sat in silence, staring at each other in the dark for what felt like forever. The mumbling got louder, as did the footsteps, until it sounded like it was right outside of our tent. We both froze. I don't think either of us were breathing. And then, silence. We waited and waited and waited. I'm still not sure how much time passed. Eventually, my girlfriend said, "We have to get to your car." The adrenaline was pumping, so I peeked out of the tent into the darkness and told her to stay behind me. Then we ran to the car. I locked the doors and she was like, "What the hell was that? We can't stay here. No one is out here but us. What was that?" I kept looking around for any signs of life, but we were seemingly alone. I looked at her and was like, "Okay, I'm gonna grab our stuff. You stay in the car." We only had our ice chest and our tent out. I hopped out and ran, grabbed our ice chest, tossed it into the back seat. As I turned around to go get the tent, I started hearing footsteps closing in again. In a moment of pure terror, I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped the tarp around it, and slung it over my shoulder like some panicked Santa Claus and shoved it into the trunk. I didn't say anything when I got in the car except, "Do we have everything in here?" My girlfriend said yes, and I floored it in reverse out of our camping area. Then we came back to a fork in the road that went in like 6 different directions. I asked my girlfriend if she remembered which path we came down to get in here, and she told me she didn't know. We chose a random one and ended up in a different camping spot. I cursed under my breath and slammed it into reverse again. Then I noticed from the angle we had exited from, I could see the main path back to the gate, thanks to a small sign behind an overgrown bush. As we hightailed it out of there, I noticed there was a single small green light out in the woods to our right, near where our designated spot was. We drove the entire 5 hours back to our hometown and fell asleep on my girlfriend's parents' couch at around 4 a.m. We never talked about the trip ever again, and I haven't had any desire to camp since. Story 5. When I was in high school, my friends and I went out to a really remote spot in the mountains to camp. Just to get there, you needed a pretty serious off-roader. It was about 30 miles up a super rough road. There were river crossings, huge boulders in the road, and tons of sand pits. This road took us all day, and all day we didn't see a single person. No one passed us. We didn't see anyone camping. Nothing. At one point, one of my friends noted it looked like no one had even driven on the road in a while, which was pretty weird because this was in Colorado and roads and trails like this are really popular. Something worth pointing out, this road led into a box canyon, which is basically nature's cul-de-sac. The road we were on was the only road in and the only road out. All around us was massive cliffs. And another thing, we were deep in the mountains, far from any cell service. On top of that, we were in a box canyon, which even if you're next to a city, never has service. All that said, we eventually got to the spot and set up camp. Every time we went camping, we played Capture the Flag. This trip was no exception. We waited for it to get dark, then started. In the middle of the second round, me and one of my friends on my team hop up on the road, which ran parallel to the area we were playing in. It seemed like a good way to get around to the other flag. Walking down the road, we began to see a glow coming towards us. Our first thought was it's another 4x4 coming towards us, but as it got closer, we realized it was a young woman holding up her phone, looking for service. She was still at a distance, but we could tell she was panicky. She was rushing and stumbling at the same time. She didn't seem drunk. It was weird. We called out, "Hello?" No response. But it wasn't just that she ignored us. It was more like she didn't realize we were there. We tried again. "You okay?" Nothing. As she's passing us, we realize she's crying. Again. You okay?" She stumbles right past us, never showing a single sign that she saw us. The whole time just looking at her phone for service. My friend and I are frozen. We watch her go, still stumbling, still crying. She rounded a turn, then disappeared. I yell out to everyone else to meet back at the camp. We do. I tell them what we saw, and I'm not proud to admit this because it seemed like she needed help, but we got creeped out. We said we'd stay in camp that night, and in the morning, we'd go looking. The first thing we do in the morning is decide there must be some other people camped down the road. they must know her. So we go down to the end of the road. There's no sign of anyone. Then we decided to go to the entrance of the road and look for the woman. So we drive to the entrance, which took all day. Nothing. I still feel guilty for not trying harder to help her. But thinking about how she got in that position, it just doesn't make sense. She didn't look like a hiker. She had on regular jeans and a sweater. If she had gone in the canyon from the other side, it would require a very technical descent. She would have needed gear, and she didn't even have a backpack. We were pretty sure we were the only ones that had driven down that road in a while, so it's not like someone dropped her off or left her. And the whole time we saw her, she was holding up her phone looking for service. If she knew the area at all, she would know there was no way she was going to find service. I don't know what to make of it, but I do know that the image of that woman, stumbling in the dark, crying, has been seared in my brain ever since.